and welcome to the Trapital podcast. I'm your host, Dan Runcie. Our guest today is Ernest Wilkins, who is a freelance journalist. He is also the CEO, the head of Office Hours, and he is a go-to person for culture and marketing, especially as it relates to hip hop and culture. Ernest, welcome to the pod.
What's up, man? That was a great intro. I feel empowered. You call me the CEO. I want to go run out and put that on my Instagram bio right quick.
Hey, you gotta think about these things, and I'm sure you probably get those too. Like, you'll get these email inbounds and it's like, oh, someone's calling me the president of this. I've never used the title president of Trapital, but sure.
Yeah, LinkedIn people are very courteous sometimes. Like, sometimes they do the absolute most, but they'll definitely give you a title that you did not give yourself. They'll be like, hey, we know you're the chairman of the national board of your newsletter. And I'm just like, am I that? Okay. Sure.
We could spend a whole session talking about LinkedIn messages and the requests that people send.
Have you ever had a rapper hit you up on LinkedIn?
I haven't had a rapper hit me up, but I've had people on their team, like their managers, hit me up on LinkedIn.
We were talking about people who call themselves CEO. I got hit up by this rapper one time. I was really impressed by the presentation because he straight up was just like, I'm the CEO and the rapper and the manager of some other rappers. And I want you to listen to our music. And I was like, you know what? What a straightforward pitch. I'm not going to listen to it because you pitched it to me through LinkedIn. But I want to be clear. I appreciated your pitch.
If he sent you a DM, would you have responded?
No. Don't send me any music, please.
Half of my DMs are like potential business opportunities, and a fraction of those are things I would consider. But then the other half of them are like DMs from people looking for coverage and things like that. I mean, I don't hate it. I respect the hustle, but no, now's not the place.
But, I'm with you.
We did not come together to give the SoundCloud rappers and everyone else hustling a hard time. We did come together to talk about challenger brands. And we're doing this today because you and I came together. You actually wanted to hit me up and said, hey, I have this idea. I think that we should both talk about this concept of challenger brands. I think that it works with what you cover in Trapital. It works with what I'm covering in Office Hours. Let's write about it. Let's podcast about it. So for the people that are less familiar, Ernest, how would you describe a challenger brand?
So the term challenger brand comes from a business book that was written in 1999 called Eating the Big Fish. I recommend, if you want to learn more about it, start there because it's essentially the starting conversation, right? The book is a marketing book, and it explains 3 specific criteria that make up a challenger brand. Now, you've heard of challenger brands. If you're listening to this right now, you don't recognize them as challenger brands, but you have heard of them. So think of Warby Parker. Warby Parker is a challenger brand. Casper is a challenger brand. Pretty much anybody that like sponsors a podcast at this point, you can think of them as a potential challenger brand, right? Under Armour is probably a strong example. And what differentiates these brands from the industry leaders that they're in and what makes them, in effect, challenger brands, 3 things. 1, the state of the market, right? So that means that the brand itself is not a market leader in its space, but also it's not a niche brand. So it means it's doing enough business to the point where you're not a number 1, you're not number 2, but you're also not at the bottom of the totem pole. You know what I mean? You see a lot of challenger brands in the rental car space. There's at least 3 that I can think of, but they all kind of exist within the same plateau of we make some money, but we don't make as much as maybe the number 1 or number 2. The second concept would be state of mind, right? So that means the brand has ambitions beyond conventional marketing resources, aka they do more with less by using unorthodox techniques, stunts, like a lot of places who influencer sponsorship. Honestly, podcast sponsorship is unconventional marketing resources for a lot of brands, until recently, I would say. So I think brands who are willing to embrace new and emerging forms of technology, stuff that you can kind of get a bigger return on your investment with less upfront capital. Now, last is that rate of success, right? So that means the brand has experienced significant and rapid growth. This isn't a sleeper where it's been kind of hiding in plain sight this whole time. These are brands that you're hearing about. You're seeing them in the national conversation, but they are not the number 1. Under Armour is not Nike. It's not Adidas, but it's still doing a really good job of marketing itself as well as doing all of the same things that those brands are doing. And the reason I thought about this for hip hop is because 1, and this is a whole other tangent I can go on, when it comes to things like media entrepreneurship I think the last couple of weeks in the publishing industry have proven anything is that voices like Black voices, marginalized voices, I'll generalize and say that, are not given the same level of platform for success. And that means things down to basic concepts like looking at brands and business the same way. I think there's a really big gap in music business coverage around this kind of stuff. I think we look at ad studies and marketing case studies and we say to ourselves, okay, we know that Coca-Cola did this. We know that Oscar Mayer did this. But the thing that I think would help realistically get a lot more marginalized folks, specifically Black folks, involved with the business of music is if they had a relevant way to understand it. And I think when we come in to the business, a lot of times your first conversation is a contract with a stranger who is basically like, yeah, you might have read that all about the music business book, but what you didn't read was how these people look at your music the second they go inside, right? I think for all the emotion that we have with any creative project, like this stuff is a product. So long story short, I wanted people to start looking at rap labels and, other organizations that are more cultural in nature, the same way you would look at these brands. And so taking that concept that would apply to a brand like an Under Armour and applying it to iconic labels that people have that brand awareness of already, like a No Limit Records or even a newer contender like QC, is the kind of thing that I'm trying to push everybody towards doing. Because if we can make the educational stuff become relevant to people's lives, then you don't have to be in those predatory situations as much.
I agree with that. And I think that even if we go back to some of those examples you brought up in the beginning, whether it's your Warby Parker or your Under Armour, they fit into two main categories. And I do think these are part of those characteristics for a challenger brand. You're either leveraging the technology capabilities we have now to produce your product at lower marginal cost. It is therefore not just cheaper, but the internet allows you to also distribute your product in a much cheaper way than you did in the past. And therefore you can reduce the cost. So if you're a Casper, you can undercut what your Sealy, Simmons, and Serta is doing. You can come in with the product and you're more likely to hit the type of person that is going to listen to a highbrow NPR or This American Life podcast. And I think that's definitely what we've seen in the past few years.
Totally.
The second group, and this is where Under Armour fits in, and I think it's where the two labels that we're going to talk about for hip hop is, you found a lane in a subsector of a lane that the broader industry wasn't necessarily focused on. Because when we go back to Under Armour, I want to say it was like 2005 or whenever the start of it was focused as this extreme brand for working out. Like, you remember those big commercials with the NFL?
We must protect this house and all that stuff. But before that, though, the history of Under Armour is crazy because that brand literally got on the map because of Any Given Sunday. The people who made Any Given Sunday, that movie, go back and watch it, Oliver Stone, if you've never seen it. They contracted Under Armour to make the jerseys for that team. And because they look so sick, that's how Under Armour entered, I think, the national conversation. And then those commercials you're talking about, that's, I think, everybody's first real, we must protect this house, all that stuff.
Right. That's a good point, because when I think back to Any Given Sunday, that is pretty much an Under Armour aesthetic with the entire movie. Yeah.
It's a commercial.
I mean, movie is extra in a lot of ways. And I think Under Armour in the 2000s was a very extra brand. But over time, and I think this is what we kind of see with both of these labels we're going to talk about, QC and No Limit, they extend themselves to be a bit more like the norm. And I think that's something you can only do when you have that niche, you define it well, and you expand from there.
Yeah. We should kind of address the concept of market share, because in industries like this, it is possible to have a dominant market share within a smaller industry, right? Like, you can be the king of making wooden furniture or something like that and have a dominant over the wooden furniture market. And I think rap is the same way, where, obviously because of the labels all kind of being, part of larger conglomerates, it's a situation where market share is so crucial. So it's truly disruptive when a brand like a QC or a No Limit comes in, because a lot of times these brands assume that they have market share everywhere. So when somebody comes in and they say, I sold 250,000 records independently, it's like, wait, what? And I think a lot of bigger brands are smart enough to say, well, instead of trying to compete, we'll just buy this person, or work in what the case that I think both of these labels had was, we're going to work in distribution with these people because we have the platform, but they have the product that everybody's looking for.
So with that, No Limit has always stuck out to me, and I'd written about them in the past as well. But yeah, they had always stuck out for a few reasons. One, I think Master P branded himself as one of hip hop's more ownership focused guys. Like if there was a chance to have a bigger pie or rather, if there's a chance to have a smaller pie and own all that pie versus having a slice of the bigger pie, he wanted to own all of the pie, and of course there's a trade-off that comes with that. But I think that mentality is what made No Limit work so well. When you look back to like the branding, how they position themselves, how successful he was before the Priority Records deal and before the majors even came through, it all stems back to that same mentality.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things I wrote about, where the story of how Master P got to that distribution deal to me is more interesting than what happened afterward, right? Because I think what happened afterward is just capitalism. Like my man did too much, tried to extend the brand too far, and now there it is. But I think the story of how he basically cornered that market share was super important. And that's the main thing I kind of tried to write about in the piece, because it was very much concentrated. He approached it like a business person would approach launching a product. And I think we've seen that kind of mentality in a lot of the more famous musical cultural movements over the last couple of decades. Like Motown's the same way. Like Berry Gordy ran it like a factory. You know what I'm saying? And so unfortunately, because of the deep emotional ties that music has with people, we don't necessarily always have the ability to step outside of that and look at this stuff for what it is. But P won by doing that. He took classes at the University of Houston on a basketball scholarship, kind of saw what you look at icons like a Jay Prince and then we're doing with the Ghetto Boys and just Rap-A-Lot Records in general, the legends like, 8Ball, MJG. And I always say, like, we talk about like the idea of the chillin' circuit, but the chillin' circuit has never gone anywhere. This weekend in Valdosta, Georgia, I guarantee you there's a rap show. And I think those secondary, tertiary markets became these hotbeds for a lot of artists. And I promise you that every Southern rapper of influence over the last 25 years will tell you the same thing. Like, you get that fan base and you get that loyalty in those small towns. And so Master P saw that, was taking business classes, and then relocated to Richmond, California to be around his family. Then his grandfather died. He got a $10,000 check as part of the negligence, I think malpractice lawsuit from the hospital that his grandpa died at. And he took that money and he was like, okay, I'm going to make a run of it. And so what he did, which I thought was interesting, was he was enrolled in community college out there and was like, okay, business, I got to learn what my customers need, right? So he's going out to the swap meets, he's talking to people, he's active in the streets. But the key differentiation that he did was, I'm going to learn about the retail side. And he opened up a record store. And that record store was No Limit Records. So what he did that I thought was super interesting was he looked at it from a business. He said, okay, my customers are these people. I need to know what they like. I need to know their habits. I need to know the things that any brand would need to know in order that you got to do the research, right? So I think it's a really important takeaway for folks who might find themselves in the position of trying to create their own little No Limit. You need more research. And I think the qualitative research when it comes to this kind of stuff is more important than the quantitative. And by that, I mean, numbers and data are great. I love that you can look at the streams and you can see where you are. But I truly believe, specifically with rap music, you still got to go outside and you got to get your music in the hands of people who can influence culture.
And with Master P's journey specifically, I think if you're missing that backstory, then you miss the whole point. Because when people talk about it, everyone remembers that iconic 1998 year when
Make them say on.
Exactly. Make them say on was everywhere. And I forget the numbers, but I want to say it was like pretty much an album every other week. The Pen and Pixel was there, the same spot in the record store, wherever you lived in the country. And I mean, it's impressive. Of course, they didn't have to go on tour. They made all their money through that year. But I mean, for all these rappers and teams, like I know Nipsey would always say, we want to build the No Limit of the West. And alone, everyone's trying to build the No Limit of X, which is kind of funny because it makes me think of the tech thing of everyone trying to build the Uber and Yelp of X. But I get it. Like, that's kind of the way
people trying to solve problems that don't need to get solved. In 1998, No Limit Records dropped 23 albums.
Okay, that's about 23. Every other week. Yeah.
Every other week, 52 weeks in a year, 23 albums over 52 weeks. I mean, for context, the previous year they dropped 8. So, I mean, and then you can actually tell when they start to get money because it's like 91, the first release was just 1, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 4 again for some reason, then 8, then 23, then, you know what I'm saying? And it just kind of went from there. And so it's scaling. When you look at that as a business, like, okay, how many products did we ship this year? We shipped this many, blah, you know, and it's very wild to look at it from that context because to your point about Nipsey and them, they are the exact same descendants of that. I believe the sexy term is direct to consumer audience, right? Like those people are the ones who are getting out here. They're in the streets. They know that people are messing with their music. And I also point this out in the piece, but when I talk about like making sure the people who are in charge of culture know you, No Limit dropped a project in 95 called Down South Hustlers, right? It's a double CD. It features rappers from no less than I think 7 different cities, right? So like Kansas City, the Dayton family was on that, so that's Flint, Michigan. The Bay obviously was involved. You had everybody from Houston on there. You know, A-Ball and JG were on there too, so that's Tennessee. Like, so you have essentially set up a local influencer program. Now, this is a stretch, but look, stick with me. If I have a product and I know that because of my work in the streets, I know the DJs, I know the promoters, I've been active, and I know that I have the hottest rapper in your city on my track, odds are the DJ, because he and I or she and I have a personal relationship, that song is going to get played. And so now I'm at a point where I can facilitate it because you still like the music and you're already a fan of Master P. You might get No Limit from dawn to dusk. You're going to hear it at the barbershop. You're going to hear it at the club on Saturday night. You're going to hear it on the radio because that's pre-97. So they had, real mix shows. And all of that, to me, is just a really savvy marketing play. It's media. It's just like you're getting earned media. People are writing about you, not so much, but they're talking about you. You're in the streets. People are sharing your stuff organically. And this is physical music that we're talking about. This isn't streams. This isn't a playlist. Like people are moving CDs. They made something like, I think he sold 250,000 copies of The Ghetto's Trying to Kill Me Independent. Like that's a lot of hand to hand, but it's because they built this machine that allowed it to that. They used to say like, roll with us or get rolled over. Like that's real.
Yeah, and you had this quote in your article, and I think it speaks to this. You said that DJs are the most underutilized method of brand awareness. And that's exactly what this is, because they are the people that you want to get that not just have the eyeballs, right? Because I think that's what gets missed with influencers. Like it's not just someone that has 800,000 or 2 million followers. Who are those people that are following? And the DJs are going to attract the tastemakers, and then those tastemakers are going to play that in their areas.
I will double down on that statement by saying, I think that 90% of the time artists spend trying to reach out to press to get coverage. They need to spend working relationships with DJs. As an example, who without a doubt is one of the most popular stories of this entire quarantine? It's probably going to be D-Nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all he's doing is his job, which is being a DJ and using the power of music to help people. And so if you have that, and you have every single city has a dominant DJ, every single city has a crew of DJs who are down. And so if your music is aligning with a certain DJ's aesthetic and you don't have a relationship because you'd rather go try to get LeBron to listen to your stuff, like it's just a bad return on your investment. Go get yourself hot in the streets. Because again, I promise, if your stuff is hot, LeBron James will find you.
Yeah, this was something I talked with Sean Prez about a couple months ago. He used to be Bad Boys VP marketing. He ran the street team. And his big thing was like, even now, yes, in the 90s, he did his thing by making sure the street team were these folks out there spreading the word and making sure these records get broken. But now in the digital era, everyone, of course, is moving to who they can try to get a DM from or who's big, has many followers. But no, like you still need to go out there. And I do think that for the folks that are willing to do this, it is a big opportunity. And because it's underserved, you will have a leg up because a lot of your peers are not doing this.
And like there's a sense, and I'll be honest with you, it's like a class thing sometimes where it's like every Chicago rapper that came up under me that I've seen or like thrown shows with, I'm always like, you know what you need to do? You need to get, once it's safe to do so, get in the car and drive down I-95. Just drive all the way to Louisiana and then, or 75, I don't know which expressway it is, but drive down there and work your way back. Because the sound that you are probably honing in Chicago, people in Memphis are going to get with, people in Kansas City, people in Baton Rouge, wherever, that stuff hits because it's all the same stuff. Like, it's all this like Northern migration. Like, you still got cousins in the country. So it's a situation where they are going to be more excited to see you because you weren't getting that new young talent coming in because they expect you to be blowing up. But the other side of it is like, you will mess around and grow a fan base. Then by the time you come home, now people are looking for you. You're now in an advantageous position because you've now built enough leverage via that market share. And in music, market share is people.
Yeah, I think that people sometimes look at, for whatever reason, I feel like there should be even more passion because this is an art form and it usually takes more feeling than something that's a straight up business. But sometimes I feel like the things that happen because it's an art form get taken granted for. Like, for instance, we were talking in the beginning about how Master P specifically had to really understand who his consumers were. And I think a lot of that just comes naturally if you are going to be selling out of your trunk, or if you're going to be opening your own record store, that naturally makes you understand the consumer. And thinking about what a lot of tech companies have done recently, they're doing a lot of these things, but they get these like modern labels that make them seem like it's inventing something from scratch. And it's like, okay, that's not really. Like, for instance, the whole concept of doing unscalable things. One of the classic stories is about the Airbnb founders. They had a few listings and they were just trying to get things off. And in the early days, they were the ones that were responding to listings. They were the ones that were going to like understand how apartments were staged and stuff like that. And it's been talked about, at least within Silicon Valley, as this like, oh yeah, you know, like they really did it. Like, that's how you got to do it. And that's all true. But it's like, they didn't invent sliced bread. Like, let's not act like people didn't spend the time with their businesses. Like, the people that are running management weren't down at the front lines doing the work as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good point to illuminate, because a lot of this stuff, man, they don't know what they're talking about. And so a lot of times you have to be able to be the person who can go and do that so important research and get out there and see it for yourself, because you can fudge numbers. You can, Jay used to say like, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. But we've seen, man, like, if you were having a tough quarter, your numbers might do some dancing. And so if that's the case, if men lie and women lie, the numbers probably lie too. So to that point, you can't necessarily build your entire career off quantitative stuff, because you're going to be that artist that has great streams, but then the time comes for you to go on tour and you can't sell out a 300 cap venue. So it's a thing for me where you have to have that balance, because in the tech side, I understand that there's a kind of, I think sometimes an over reliance on data. And so I caution artists, specifically rap artists, that the stuff is taken with the context of the people who made it. And I think the same way we're talking about media
survivorship bias. Yeah.
Survivorship bias, period. And so I think that's just a very important thing to call out.
And when thinking about that balance between data and just understanding what's happening, that's something that rings true with QC as well. One of the things that I think people often forget, that I think it's hilarious, but it speaks about the truth. There was some interview where Pierre P. Thomas, he's the CEO of Quality Control Music, he had said that he didn't own a computer. He was like, y'all might think I'm ignorant, but I don't own a computer. Like, all these other labels are looking at these streams and your Instagram likes. And he's like, I don't care about that stuff as much. Like, I'm in it. And like a lot of those intangibles speak to, I don't want to say old school, but it speaks to a form that's like, no, like, we see where things are going. This can help our game, but this is not going to take over our game. And I think that he did a really good job of that. And I think that has spoken a lot to the success, that and several other things, that spoke a lot to the success of why quality control works and why it's been successful the past 7 years.
I enjoyed your article too, because I think you made a great point about the ecosystem of Atlanta and how obviously, like, it's ideal if you want to work in music, right? And I think to that point, P and Coach K, I only know more so about Coach K, but they are the descendants of Master P in this context. They are keeping the true kind of essence, that same essence that original Def Jam, that same essence that Cold Crush, that same essence that all of these legendary rap labels put together, which was, we got to get in the streets and we also have to get in these boardrooms. And so that's some very Atlanta shit. Having lived there for a couple of years, you know, I saw it in real time being a native of Chicago. And I was like, damn, I wish we could do that in Chicago, because you have your entire supply chain damn near in one place. But also, if we make a song tonight, we can go to the club in real time and hear it get played. If it's a hit in the strip club or wherever we're playing it, good, we know. And now we're going to go serve it to the DJs and all that stuff.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, why do you think that couldn't happen in Chicago?
Again, there are people who have a lot of different thoughts, but it's the same thing. The reason that Chicago itself could not be a bigger cultural player, and it's segregation, lack of resources, and the resources that we do have. My dad used to say, Chicago's a city where the people with money have no taste and the people with taste have no money.
Say more about the segregation piece, because I know people would say that Atlanta's segregated too. I'd spent a bit of time there too.
Yeah. I mean, I've lived in both, and I think Chicago it's fascinating how segregated it is and how accepted that segregation is, because it truly is. There's a street called Roosevelt. You go across Roosevelt, you are no longer in what people call Chicago. And you see that segregation reflected in how like food and drink coverage happens in the city. And a lot of times that reflects on music because, and I can speak from experience with this because I was working at the Chicago Tribune in 2011, 2012, when Chief Keef became the national darling of the city. And so I got to firsthand see like our team was the first team to go to Keef's grandma's house. So we had like the first Chief Keef interview at length ever, right? The thing I kept seeing was all of this amazing talent all of a sudden is bubbling up. But the thing is, it's always been there. The only thing that changed was we had all of this, like, I call it like the flight of the A&Rs, because you had this like parachute in of all these A&Rs and all these marketing people and all these brand people who are like, Chicago's hot, let's get in. And so you saw for the first time what could happen if Chicago talent got resources, because a lot of stuff got built. A lot of studios are standing now because of that. And a lot of artists are giving back and setting up programs. And there's already existing stuff. Like, let me be very serious. Like Chicago I actually have been working with the city of Chicago for the last 6 or 7 months, because we're trying to do something around the Department of Culture and Cultural Affairs to say like, hey, how can we continue this legacy of Chicago music? Because, you know, like Chicago's musical history is crazy, like Muddy Waters, you know, all of that legendary chess music and the blues and all of that coming into house music and all of that coming into rap, and now Kanye's in Wyoming. So that's the long answer. The short answer is the segregation is a really unfortunate problem in Chicago because it's something that's ingrained. And I think that if it was not, I think we'd see more of an Atlanta type scenario in Chicago.
I could see that. Yeah, because I think with Atlanta specifically, it's interesting where, QC was able to get infrastructure and start building things. The difference, though, and I talked a little bit about this in the article, is that it's not like Atlanta was this dormant market by any means. It was already the hottest market in hip hop. But I think what people forget is that there's a big difference between whether it was So Def or LaFace coming in and it's like, okay, yeah, we're here, but we still rely on everyone in the coast to get stuff done. Right. So we kind of have like a satellite office here. Versus QC, not only did they come at it from a bit of a different perspective, they also had a stronger ecosystem around them, both with what's happening in entertainment, what's happening in tech right now, how much easier it is for those things to happen given technology. And not only do I think that they just went about it differently, I think they had benefits to their advantage that, you know, respectively speaking, Jermaine Dupri or Babyface didn't necessarily have in the 90s.
It's tricky because I think Jermaine Dupri is a better exec, because Babyface was making R&B, right? So like he had that R&B money going. I think So Def, like they got on because of previously existing ties. So you had those satellite offices, which they're not much, but they're important because a lot of cities don't even have those. So if I could go to Atlanta, where a lot of, you know, in the 90s specifically, it was super cheap. Like you could go set up and build a studio like a Stankonia or a Patchwork or something like that, or a Tree Sound, and you can have that piece of it, right? So the strip club culture been there forever. That's a piece of it. You have the folks who are using this as like the interstate. You're going back and forth from, you know, Florida to wherever. It's a stop. So I think there's a lot of cultural factors that go into Atlanta's dominance. And I think that it's not able to be replicated because the conditions that created it aren't something you can you can't make a city cheaper and then give people the ability, specifically Black people, the ability to make enough money to build things and own things. And I think that's why Atlanta is great. I think with other cities, though, the key that I want to talk about is it doesn't matter where you are, because if you can look and see that you have data, or if you can get in your car and go and see that you can draw an audience, you have to kind of be able to use both of those skill sets accordingly to build your empire.
A few things. I think from a label perspective, I do think that where you set up shop does make a little bit more of a difference. From an artist perspective now, I think you do have a bit more flexibility. It's been dope to see what's happening, like South Florida, especially the past 5 or 6 years. Memphis, if we're dating back a little bit earlier, but even more recently. They definitely had these regions come up. And I do think that Atlanta has a lot of potential, because I think when you think about the artist on that label, and I guess this is where QC and No Limit differ a little bit. I've always jokingly said people get mad when I say this, but Master P, I think, did the most with the label that really wasn't the most talented artist, but it just shows how well skilled. I worded it that way in case Silk the Shockers listen to this.
He don't pull up on you on Instagram.
but yeah, I do think that on the other hand, though, QC does have the talent. I mean, Lil Baby has been one of the hottest artists this quarantine, this 2020.
I haven't heard a bad Lil Baby verse in 9 months.
Right.
Pre-COVID. I was like, he hasn't missed it. He hasn't missed in a while. You know what I'm saying? You see somebody play basketball, they haven't missed in a while. It's like, hey.
And it's even crazy because this guy started rapping 3 years ago.
Oh, yeah, I love it. Yeah, that's inspiring to me.
Yeah, the story's great. And this is another thing that it often gets talked about in tech, but doesn't get talked about in hip hop in that same type of way is, there's always this whole talk about second time founders. They're always more experienced. They come to the game and they're more likely to get funding from the VCs. They're more likely to do this. That's all true. But I think that there's nuances with hip hop as well, because both P and Coach K came in with experience. They had started record labels. They didn't necessarily work out, but you learn a lot from that. And when you have Coach K having a bit more experience, because he had managed Jeezy, got fired by Jeezy, managed Gucci. If you manage those artists, you understand what's going on. And obviously, P's born and raised there. So when you combine that, I think that they had the experience, but also they also just had a willingness to be able to work with youth. And I think that's a subtle thing that people often forget. In the article, I brought up the comparison to Roc Nation. I use them in that sense because I think it's an easier one for people to follow. But if people are a bit older and more mature in the game, they're more likely to want to start companies with the areas that they know. And if you look at Roc Nation's management artists, it's a lot of Jay-Z's peers from the tri-state area that he came up with. All the people that are in their 40s and 50s now, like him, versus QC and P. These are two men in their 40s and managing these 20-year-olds. They have to build their trust. You have to understand how to talk to them in a way where you're not just back in my day. No, you got to understand, I can learn from a 19-year-old with fruit juice colored braids in his hair like Lil Yachty. I can learn from these two women in Miami that are blowing up in the scene as well with City Girls. You got to be able to have that humility. And those are the subtle things I think get missed with management and just also with being an executive in this game.
I interned for the late, great Shakir Stewart. And one of the things he said to me one time that I will never forget was he goes, "Don't be too smart for your own good." And I think a lot of times specifically when someone has triumphed in an industry that's really tough, it's very hard to get them to look at success in any other way than the way that they did it, right? They don't want to hear that you can just make a record now and put it out that night and get 100,000 streams because they're used to carrying crates through the club, And so I agree with your point, because that's the difference between good and great business and truthfully good and great leadership, because it's hey, you know what we don't know, we can learn, but let's not be too smart for our own good. Let's go see what these kids are into without judgment or without the comparison that's not fair to a bygone era. You can say, yo, this is something that the streets are invested in, but also the culture is the kids, man. Rap is youth culture, period. So the reason you see a lot of artists fall off is because they fossilize culturally, right? So their brains get hard and they say, well, this is the best it's ever going to be because they were the top of the social hierarchy. They were the most popping. So that's the best it's ever going to be. And that's the same reason I feel like a lot of these sub-labels that are vanity imprints that an artist who, may have gone gold gets, and then their whole team doesn't get on. It's because it's like you're using your perspective as the main perspective versus going and doing good business, which is going and doing your research, going out and seeing what's happening in Miami, going out and seeing Lil Yachty's got the kid parties going crazy. That level of transparency and that level of honesty with yourself is why they're winning, because they know that they don't know.
Yeah, they figured it out. And I think that's going to help them very well moving forward, because we just got to be real. Most artists don't stay hot forever. And a lot of the artists on QC's label have already had their moment. So now they're most likely going to have to transition into who are the Gen Z rappers out there. Like, it's funny. I occasionally will talk to my 10-year-old nephew who listens to all these people that I haven't even heard of. Like, well, I mean, I've heard of them because I follow, but I'm like, I've never even saw the blip besides seeing their name come up on a headline and you telling me about them. But those are the kind of artists that I know that labels like QC are going to have to start going after. And I know that it's going to be an even more different language than what they might be used to with a Lil Baby or a Takeoff or anyone else that's on the label right now. So I think they'll be fine. But, nothing is guaranteed in this game. I think if you're trying to run a boutique shop like QC, you do end up only being as strong as the few flagship artists that you have. And you got to hope that you could have another moment like Migos in 2017 or Lil Baby right now to keep that going.
It's also a nice point to bring out with Master P's kind of rise, because that was one thing that he did well the first time, which led to the success that they had in No Limit, was when Master P moved back from California to New Orleans, there was tons of competition in the city already in the music space. You had obviously Cash Money, but you had these little labels that are more niche, that weren't challenger brands in the larger sense, but still were populating the market. So, one specifically is called Parkway Pumpin'. Roster, traditionally was pretty much that previous label's roster, right? So you think about Fiend, Mac, Mr. Servant, Soulja Slim, all of those people were on Parkway Pumpin', and now they're on No Limit. And the reason that it happened is because Parkway operated without any contracts. That's unfortunate. But that's a thing that I think P learned, because he was like, I got to switch it up, because the people the original artists that were signing No Limit weren't as relevant anymore. And so he switched it up and it brought him success. But then I think the issue with him was he didn't switch it up again, right? He was like, okay, if it's No Limit, they're going to like it, which is true, because for a while, 23 albums in a year, people were just buying it because it had No Limit and the Pen and Pixel. You know what I'm saying? So he didn't pivot properly, because he was like, okay. And honestly, he did try again with Lil Romeo, right? We can't deny Lil Romeo, right? Because he did have some hot singles. Yeah. So you saw Pete try it again, but the problem is he couldn't stick it. And even the second time he came back with the Al Capone stuff, he got with Fat Trell and all that. They get it because they understand that they can't be the hot young shit anymore. So now it's like we have to be able to speak to that audience in a credible way.
And I know that they had family troubles as well. What was the in-house label group that was his cousin's?
KLC, Beats by the Pound.
Yeah, when Beats by the Pound left, that caused the whole split. And then C Murder.
KLC is the story of No Limit. And obviously C Murder going to jail, free C Murder. But it's very wild, because KLC is probably the single most important, other than Manny Fresh, the two most important people to New Orleans rap. Because KLC, he assembled Beats by the Pound, which is him, Moby Dick, his cousin, and a couple other people. I might be getting that wrong, so don't hold me to that. But they were the sound of No Limit Records. That is the sound of Beats by the Pound is the sound of No Limit, the same way Manny Fresh is the sound of Cash Money. Right. Same as Swizz Beatz is the sound of Rough Riders. I think that's another thing where we talk about, from a brand perspective, you notice that a lot of the challenger brands that are popular in any industry always have some iconic thing that you know them for, right? Under Armour, Aggressive, you get that U and that A. You think about Casper, it's like the bed in the box. And No Limit was the tank, and it was those album covers, to the point where everybody started doing Pen and Pixel album covers. Because if you look at that on a shelf in your record store, Big Bear is having things that wasn't a No Limit, but it's it's going to stand out to you. So that's the kind of thing that I think is just kind of important to call out, because with challenger brands, we think about marketing as like tactics, right? Like, hey, I have to do my stream numbers. I have to have all my social accounts, all that stuff. But the stuff you're doing, the consistent branding that you're doing, like, you think about chains, you think about Rockefeller, you think about the diamond, you think about that chain.
Yep.
And so those branding things, if I know that I can throw up a sign and that's your team, or I know that I can rep that set, I'm going to have that brand affinity because now it's more than music. Now you're part of my everyday.
Right. You need those tokens. You need those things that you can be like, yes, this is
the best
me.
example, modern example. Like, he's a challenger brand, but he also, like, I don't think he's trying to be, is Currency, right? The Jets are loyal. They are deep. They are consistent, and they are on time. And they all like a good album filled with raps. And so, like, Currency wins because he knows the Jets need something to ride to. They got the Jet Life apparel. You're going to see it in the blocks. Anybody with a cool car. I think that's the kind of stuff where the mentality of branding yourself to an audience, when you start unfortunately thinking of your music as a product, is a piece that people miss. They go, oh, I'm just going to wear designer and people are just going to look at me on the internet. But it's like, nah, like, how can I see myself in you?
No, that makes sense. So when you were thinking about this and we were both thinking about the identity of a challenger brand, what were some of the other ones that came to mind? Like, what were some of the other, like, specifically in hip hop?
I think in hip hop, it's tricky, but I think the biggest challenger brand in the record industry is XL Records. I mean, they are, an independent, they have a distro deal, but they are creating what they want to create. And they have that market share, but they also put out Adele records. You know what I'm saying? Like, they have the ability to be a major player in the space despite not having all the same tools as a major. So in rap, I mean, they do some rap, but I would say, I know you had a really great example of just having, like, Griselda's a really great example.
Yeah, Griselda, I think, identify themselves or branded themselves pretty well, almost in that Under Armour type way where, and not that I would even consider Griselda aggressive, but when we think about how hip hop has changed in the past 6 or 7 years, like, since the streaming era took off, like, music got slower, like the trap beats and the quote unquote Travis Scott style influence. I mean, I wouldn't say just him, Future as well, but a lot of that type of artistry and style got copied so much over. And that's very different than what a lot of the Gen X hip hop fans grew up with, right? Like, they want the boom bap, like, they want the music that makes them feel like they're listening to like one of Nas's albums in the 90s or something that's made by Premier. And I think that they hit that market well. They also were speaking about regions you don't normally see something from. I've never been to Buffalo in my life. I feel like I'm pretty well traveled in the US, but they're putting a city like that on the map and they have all the stories to be like, hey, this is happening. And, it's not like they're out here trying to stunt about it. They're building their fan base. They know that they can go to shows. They're selling out in different areas. And this is actually a small tactic that works very well for them. The people that they cater to, as I mentioned, like the Gen X or even some of those older millennials, those are a lot of the people that currently run hip hop media, right? Yep. So if you are making the music that a Charlemagne the God or Elliot Wilson is going to naturally like, you're going to get more coverage than a Lil fill in the blank that is bumping on SoundCloud.
But that's knowing your niche, and that's being like a challenger brand. Like, I think Diplomats were a good example of them as well back in the day. But the thing about Griselda that, and also real quick, want to shout out Elliot Wilson because the hardcover project he does with Danielle Smith and Darian Harvin is dope. So shout out to them. But I think it's really important to hone in on the piece that you just said around they are really good at giving you their lifestyle. Griselda shows were happening in Chicago. They probably had 2 or 3 shows truly before everybody found out about Griselda. Like, just people that I knew were throwing them. They were working with them. And so it's something where they did the old school method. And I think a lot of artists are smart enough to have seen what a Master P did, who have seen even now what a QC did. And they're like, oh, okay. We can make our own. We can bring people into our world. We can corner this market that is definitely aching for something new. We can bring that and we can put it in a package that's familiar to people. Because, like, Westside Gunn's album is great, but he also has some boom bap stuff on there and he's got some fashion stuff. You know what I'm saying? So he's speaking to a very specific audience. And I think they're going to be successful because that audience is being served really great product too.
Right.
Like, they learn from a No Limit. There are no duds on that label. Right? Like, I haven't heard a bad Griselda rap yet.
No, neither have I.
At all. And so it's like, okay, cool. You look at something like a collaboration or something like that where an alchemist or someone like that will come in, like they're able to float their brand on a different context. They can have a heavy, darker sound, or it can have some street shit, or they can have something that sounds like classic Ghostface, and it all works because it's their brand.
Yeah, they're doing it. They figured it out. And I think that they'll continue to rise in a few years. Like if you and I connect on Challenger brands, we'll probably have even something stronger to talk about with regards.
I hope they're a case study of what's to come, truly, because I think the other piece of this, and this is for older artists, you can become a challenger brand in the space mostly because you already have brand awareness. That's why Joe Budden's winning. Joe Budden had awareness already, the shows, all that stuff that he was doing, and being a rapper. But that man literally was like, okay, bet I'm going to take my brand awareness and I'm going to become a challenger brand in a different industry. He was like, screw rap. I'm going to go over here in this podcast and get it popping. And now he is a challenger brand still somehow because he's not still looked at in the same levels as, I think, a challenger brand in the broader sense. Like, I think he's dominated rap, but I think like he's in a Joe Rogan, that level space where he's a challenger brand for those heavy hitters. And that team, I think, were so smart to put that together. But that's a perfect example, too. Like, if you're an older artist or Noriega, you see with Drink Champs, and your lane in that industry is filled, like, jump in something else. Everybody and their mom has a podcast now, so maybe not that. You should also just only listen to Office Hours and the Trapital podcast. But I think it's important to just say, like, hey, if there's another industry that you are in, that you can dive in and really become a challenger brand in that space, you're going to have a leg up because people already know who you are.
Well said. Well, before we end this, anything else that listeners should know about challenger brands or anything else that you ought to make sure people know about?
I would advise anyone who is running their team, their rap team, to go read Eating the Big Fish. I would say look at your current situation for the next 6 months, and you should lay it out and see if you are a challenger brand or you need to get into a position where you can become one. And I think everybody should read Office Hours. It's a great newsletter. Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, the best cultural analysis, music, and marketing tips. I am everywhere on the internet at Ernest Wilkins. What's up? No A in that Ernest.
And where could they subscribe to Office Hours?
You're going to go to officehours.substack.com. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram. It's all the same, Ernest Wilkins.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell at least one friend about this podcast. Word of mouth is still the best way to grow. Go to Apple Podcast, go to iTunes, leave a review, rate the podcast. I will screenshot and share the podcast ratings on Twitter and Instagram. That can encourage more people to share the podcast. And if this podcast is your first introduction to Trapital, then make sure you check out the rest of the content. Go to trapital.co. That's trapital.co. Sign up for the weekly newsletter, get all the content there. And also shoot me a text. That's also a great way to stay in touch with Trapital content. You can text me, Dan Runcie, at 415-234-3074. Thanks again. See you next week.